There's something about the weather. Last year, bushfires in Australia scorched 46 million acres, an area larger than Hungary and Portugal combined. Flames shot nearly half a mile in the air, killing 34 humans and more than 1 billion animals. And in the United States this year, 8.2 million acres burned, killing 37 people and displacing countless others. Swarms of locusts darkened the sky in parts of East Africa and West Asia, devouring plants and fruits as they tore through the land, leaving hardly a scrap of green. And a single living swarm in Kenya amassed to a size 3 times larger than New York City. Tens of millions faced increased food security, insecurity, and hunger. But the horsemen of the apocalypse can't ride without a plague. The coronavirus pandemic swept the globe, sharpening two competing visions of humanity, one based on the science and caretaking, and the other on pure make-believe. The most powerful nation in the world chose the latter. And across the United States, Black, brown, indigenous, migrant, and poor people in general have bore the brunt of the virus. Even tepid social reforms like universal health care, largely a reality for most nations of the global north, was off the table. Instead, hundreds of thousands of people needlessly died, oftentimes alone, without access to life-saving medications or treatment available to the super rich. A large part of humanity perished, taking a little piece of our heart with them. Others who either survived the virus's symptoms or had lost their jobs, or all three, were left to fend for themselves as billionaires raked in record earnings. In places like the Navajo Nation, which is not far from where I'm calling, rates of infection are exacerbated by centuries of resource colonialism. While its rivers have been diverted to water golf courses in Phoenix, Arizona, and its mesas mined for coal to power the Southwest, about 30% of its population lives without running water, and 10% live without electricity. Navajo grandmothers who have hauled water for 90 years of their lives next to fracking rigs that pump millions of gallons of fresh water into the ground to crack it open during the fracking process, which both pollutes the land and the water. This is in a desert landscape where water is especially scarce. In Indian country, tribes that took serious the science closed their borders and set up emergency health protections. Yet the make-believe approach won over many. And once it was revealed in the media that the virus disproportionately impacted non-white communities, heavily armed men, most of whom were white, stormed state capitals, demanding haircuts and the reopening of restaurants. The virus intensified and spread, and with it came a toxic atmosphere of cynicism and hatred. Coronavirus is like climate change. The most advanced capitalist countries were warned about the threats far in advance. They had access to the best science and experts and did nothing. US officials cynically renamed fossil fuels emitted into the atmosphere molecules of US freedom. And US leaders blamed the coronavirus massive body count not on an inhumane for-profit healthcare system, but on a foreign country, China, because of its socialized healthcare system, which is similar in Cuba and Vietnam. They swiftly and all but eliminated the threat of the virus within a matter of months as it continued to spread elsewhere. And despite the massive death and destruction, a viable alternative within the mainstream North American politics didn't coalesce. And 2020 is on track to be the hottest year on record. And this flies in the face of the fact that the current administration and the incoming administration have no real plan for addressing climate change, let alone addressing the coronavirus, in spite of China's pledge to become carbon neutral by 2060. And so I think some of the other speakers have mentioned previously that what is at stake here is not simply racism on a domestic scale, but the real threat to an alternative, or the real threat to neoliberalism and the alternative of the current global order that's dominated by the United States. And we can look no further than Bolivia and understand that the recent coup that happened last year against Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism was recently overturned. So Evo Morales has returned back to the country, and with him and the election of Luis Arce as president and David Chicohuenca as vice president, the indigenous revolution continues. And not only had the coup government With the support of the United States overthrowing the administration, they also tried to crush the project for decolonization it represented. And specifically relates to the path of resource nationalism that Bolivia took, specifically in nationalizing its lithium reserves, which, as everyone knows, is a key ingredient for rechargeable batteries, which is necessary for any kind of post-carbon future that we may want to live in. And as an organization, the Red Nation, we take inspiration from Bolivia and the 2010 People's Accords that were drafted in Cochabamba, Bolivia, a large part of the Proceso de Cambio, the process of change. The accords themselves spell out principles of ecofeminism, eco-socialism, and anti-imperialism, infused with traditional indigenous ecological knowledge. And that's the spirit in which we operate in, and understanding that not only does climate justice have to be focused on decolonization, but it also has to be focused on anti-imperialism. And for the sake of this specific talk, I think it's important to talk about the role that US militarism has played in places like the Pacific, specifically ramping up aggression towards China. So after the 19th century, the US military industrial complex developed at an unprecedented rate on stolen lands in occupied Hawaii. In the early 1900s, the US military established infrastructure dedicated to coastal defense and infantry with various forts, named after various generals of the United States. In the 1930s, airfields were built, and after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the United States tightened its military grip by instituting martial law, erecting concentration camps, and increasing recruitment of Japanese Americans to be deployed in World War II. The Cold War subsequently ushered in more military expenditures to Hawaii, like the creation of the Barking Sands Missile Facility on the island of Kauai. For the first time in the 1940s, US military spending became the largest source of revenue in the islands. So reports from 2008 suggested across Hawaiian Islands, the collective military forces of the United States maintained 21 military installations, 26 housing complexes, 8 training areas, and 19 bases of operating stations. Armed forces, military dependents, and veterans make up more than 16% of Hawaii's entire population, and some estimate that that could be upwards to 20%. Estimates from 2013 indicated that the military controls more than 230,000 acres of land in Hawaii. And on the island of Oahu, about 94,000 acres are controlled by the military, which makes up approximately 25% of the whole island. Recent reports show US military spending in Hawaii was about 8.8 billion, and I think that's increased to around close to 10 billion, which ranked second only to the $14.7 billion that tourists spend in the island alone. So a key example of how US employs militarization to justify its illegal occupation of the island is RIMPAC, occurring once every 2 years in Hawaii, and it occurred this year in August. Around its water, the rim of the Pacific war games are hosted by the US Pacific Fleet, which is a subordinate command of PACOM, the US Pacific Command. Headquartered in Hawaii, PACOM held 300,000 military personnel, which was about 20% of the total US active duty military force. But as their official website states, this number has increased to around 360,000, and it's responsible for policing approximately half the Earth's surface. PACOM's mission is to protect, according to its definition, is to protect and defend in concert with other US government agencies, the territory of the United States, its people and interests. With allies and partners, PACOM is committed to enhancing stability in the Asia-Pacific region by promoting security cooperation, encouraging peaceful development, responding to contingencies, deterring aggression, and when necessary, fighting to win. And that's the quote from its stated mission. So starting in 1971, RIMPAC is the world's largest multinational maritime training exercise in which the US Navy invites militaries to participate from nations all over the world. It is, as Kanaka Maoli scholar and activist Hawane K. Trask said, the haole, or the foreign war machine, including nuclear submarines and missiles, is well-oiled and ready for deployment on a moment's notice. Hawaii, like most of the Pacific, is a nuclearized paradise. And I think it's important to understand that the origins of the Cold War, the old Cold War, originate in nuclear imperialism. And I live in a place in New Mexico where the atomic bomb was not only invented and tested for the first time, but it was also here where uranium was mined and refined, and also tested upon the local indigenous population. That project, led to the global kind of supremacy of the United States, having been the only nation in the world to ever use that bomb against, in a wartime scenario against another civilian population. It should be also noted that the effects of radiation and the continued fallout from the nuclear weapons industry in places like New Mexico has been impacting indigenous people and also non-indigenous people as well. So there isn't just military targets within this kind of nuclear complex that has developed. And we can see that within the militarization of the Pacific itself, it's centering and pivoting, as Obama said, towards China, and that this is just a continuation of the Indian Wars that the United States fought on the Western frontier, that was extended to the Pacific, as we can see with the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 19th century and the militarization of Hawaii as a site for U.S. hegemony and continued military exercises. And with that in mind, I think it's important to understand that this current administration has a mandate to begin a green transition, and a lot of that money, as we know of, as people who have experienced U.S. military aggression, we know a lot of that money is going to go directly towards military expenditures. And in fact, it's important to remember that the U.S. military itself is one of the largest polluters on the planet. And a lot of that comes from its more than 800 military installations around the world, which is an expansive and expensive carbon footprint, not only in dollar terms, but in the fact that the United States has almost single-handedly with the North Atlantic powers colonized the atmosphere. As some of the other panelists have pointed out, the carbon emissions from China actually go towards producing goods that are going to be consumed in the first world, especially in the United States. So that carbon footprint is more so ours than anyone else's. And the fact of the matter is the U.S. military is deeply intertwined with the fossil fuel industry, and the history of fighting wars for oil. But then also the kind of global sanctions campaign that the United States is almost unilaterally pushing against oil-producing nations such as Venezuela and Iran. And to kind of wrap it up and to think about where indigenous people and decolonization movements play an important role in advocating for peace in this moment, is thinking about the current land back movement in places like the United States and Canada, where indigenous people are attempting to reclaim land and attempting to build economies that are based around their needs and not for profit. So the focus on land is not just within the so-called domestic territory of the United States. Indigenous activists have also been calling for demilitarization, and that means land back to nations and territories occupied by more than the 800 overseas US military bases that violate the sovereignty of the nations or threaten the sovereignty of the nations in terms of China. This includes places like Guantanamo Bay, which must be restored back to Cuba, Okinawa, Korea, Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines, Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, and so many other places the US occupies. And if we don't do something now, the United States, even under the Biden administration, is going to continue the project of militarizing the globe. And the United States holds the future of the planet hostage, not only in terms of how we understand US military aggression, but how we as humanity can combat climate change. Thank you very much.